I'm curious how you would say that the wealth gap in the United States, how would you say that's not evidence of systemic racism?
Okay, so how much has Jim Crow affected a wealth gap that Black Americans have continued and seemingly will continue to experience through all sort of economic graphing, despite how much policy we are putting forth to, quote unquote, help Black people? A really interesting book to read is Discrimination and Disparities by Tom Sowell, where he talks about the wealth income gap between Black and white Americans. And he talks about this period specifically within Jim Crow America, where the white poverty rate stayed just about the same for about 20 years. And during that 20 years, the Black poverty rate dropped by about 40 percentage points. So in the middle of legislated racism by the government, the Black poverty rate was decreasing at levels that we've never seen before. And then suddenly we get the civil rights movement, and Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president and institutes all this social welfare system and incentivizes single mothers, and that poverty rate starts to stop decreasing. I'm curious how you...
The systems in place by racism without race, I'll put the resources in the comments, but are in the source material. But basically, when you have wizard terrorism, the function of the KKK is to engage in economic terrorism in destabilizing the general populations, at which point the negotiations the KKK had when engaged with the FBI and COINTELPRO and MKUltra and the other subversions to the free society and free market generate a black market contract system, at which point the black market is derived by black books on black sites, which functionally by definition aren't trackable charts, at which point the trades certified by the brokers for the crime have access to all of the data and the information tracking the procedures of each of the criminal contracts exchanged, at which point they have an alternative resource which generates their ability to keep track of payments and supports for their structure, generating the crime market defense funding, at which point the point of the Contras program was to make funding for the illegal funding was generated for the war and the Contras, etc. At which point it is an extension of pre-existing markets which have already been established, at which point you have the Dulles brothers and other functions such as the generation of prohibition, which all that did was centralize the power and control over the black market of alcohol. So once they legalized it, those approved of by the government from the collapsed market then exponentially had the majority of the market, at which point the Wizard Communists, having sold access to the market, release the market to those that they have prescribed permission to from their black market brokerage sites, at which point you have the mechanism of the crime market under secrecy. And the system of crime markets under secrecy includes the functionality of observing the black community collaborating with each other, decreasing the poverty line amongst them, at which point the social programs serving as a cover gives the justification of those who are not directly compliant with the racism without race systems, at which point those who aren't directly racist or the step just beyond racism in the Racism Without Race, which is a book which is a must read for the understanding of the system of the creation of racist policies by the system of intentionally writing the policy wrong for the criminal injury. At which point, if you have a terrorist program in secret, such as the statement that they don't have a right over their bodies and that they can be poisoned and manipulated as it's seen fit, such as the military's poisoning of poor black communities, which has happened throughout the United States history, has generated these weaknesses, at which points you have a destabilizing function, including the function of the fraudulent policies which aren't designed to work under the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. The social programs being designed wrong are specifically arranged for the express order of failing, at which point their funding of the thing is the statement that they are taking a settlement, at which point their settlement is the vulnerability to the crime of the subversion, at which point they're attacked by the COINTELPRO type programs, and in their being subverted, they are given the social program, which functions as payment for having been destabilized, at which point the centralized function, furthermore, beyond these points, the centralizing function of the communities working together, decreasing the poverty line, is decentralized by the larger social program, which means they no longer have to cooperate. And while they haven't done the necessary research in order to conduct the intentionality of the natural side effects of being mutually oppressed as a collective group, they are given the social program, which decentralizes their attention from their collective position of being abused, at which point they're no longer collaborating with each other, which increases the poverty line as they are giving each other fewer opportunities, as they are specifically connected as having already been taken care of by the social program, justifying the wizard terrorism's continued harassment and abuse of the community without the direct noticeable affairs, at which point you have the phantom cells, which are actively protecting each other by the protection of the strategic application of each particular wizard communist role in its diced apart functions. So you have an entire program and you have their sub-roles, and each of the roles in this position from a phantom cell only knows their single particular role without understanding the larger scheme. And the function is a military tactic which has actively been progressed and implemented in the Middle East for the development of the terrorists in order to subvert the Soviets in the Middle East, at which point the white nationalists, having taught the terrorists in the Middle East how to do CIA operations, have created those regions' CIA variants, which are following the exact protocols exactly as they were designed, which are specifically for the collapse of their general group, at which point they are taking a sword serpent, and the sword serpent is going to eat them while destroying their enemies, at which point the systems of promises of assistance and prosperity is actually systematic traps by a centrally planned economy, predetermining winners and losers by the function of secrets, at which point the activity of having secret crimes against the specific civilian populations is a criminal act, as it is a punishment without a crime, as it is the illegal application of a declaration of war against civilians without cause, and the government not having a right to be an enemy, force the public to be an enemy of the government without due process, and seeing as how the government does not have a right to make anyone guilty, these functions are inherently anti-American, as they are Confederate militias, which, having been defeated, were not dissolved, allowing for the continuation of their criminal function in the destruction of these communities, such as the prosperous black communities, which had been overthrown when in North Carolina when they overthrew the government to get rid of the black people, or the black community which was getting too prosperous, which they destroyed and flooded and turned it into a lake. These are actual functional acts of criminal treason by a terrorist organization conducting hate crimes under the false permissions and protections of secrets, as those secrets are the primary mechanism of the Ku Klux Klan engaged in wizard terrorism, and the function of their wizard terrorism is secrecy or the use of magic, and the function of them concealing their identities and their criminal actions is a constructive magic system which allows them to sell and distribute crime or magic spells. The threats implemented, including the functionality of engaging in a poison or assault against a civilian, compelling them to comply with the remedy to their physical error. The physical error being the damages of the attack, while under the custody of the government was the liability of the government to pay, and while the government is denying that they had custody, the existence of the injury is derived by the compulsion or the coercion into the remedy, such as the engagement of forcing the person into a hospital, at which point you have the systems of depleting their accounts by these coercive armed robberies, covering the liability of the obligations of the government who have a possession of a prisoner. And since these are a criminal act of war, the functionality is the protection of a prisoner of war, at which point the function of a prisoner of war are owed the rights of a prisoner of war, and being denied these rights is a war crime, and the functionality of their engagement of the war crimes allows them to systematically deplete the accounts by mishaps and misunderstandings and subversions of the general economy in the society, which would have otherwise been stable had they not existed. At which point you have the sales and distribution of that crime market, or the magic system, which allows for the subversions against one's friends, families, neighbors, hated ones, enemies, and so on, including the rape culture, which is the sales and distribution of Plato's conspiracy of the centrally planned sexual market opportunities, which is compounded by the criminal magic system, which allows for the compliance of the secret currencies exchanged illegally by these systems in order to generate compliance with the total objectives of the wizard clan's objectives, at which point the mechanism of reproducing that currency and its function in that society allows them to keep track of who can buy what contract, at which point those who have more magic points get more magic contracts and subversions, and thus their wishes are satisfied by the criminal exchanges on the market and that of their communities, as their collaborations in these functions generated by the value to the Confederacy in their overthrow of the United States money is payment for an act of war against the United States government for the overthrowing of the government, which is treason and the funding of treason withstanding, such as J. Secular Civil War, which is coerced by the Confederates overthrowing California to use it as a proxy in the conquering of the other states, in the mechanism of using government surveillance against the will of California's republic, which was subsequently changed in the overthrow of their government, servicing them as a second federal government for the Confederacy against the American Republic, as they engaged in the systematic transfer of power from the United States to the KKK Wizard operations, which gives the promise of the Faustian deal to the black communities and to women, such as the Feminist Incorporated operations, which is using the magic system for the women arrangements, which is lip service without substance on most of the exchanges, at which point the women retaliating against men, or any men in general, allows them to feel a bit of satisfaction without any substantive advantage to their collective political goals as a community, at which point women, having overpowered the Confederates with their political currencies, are subverting those currencies by the sales and distributions and collaborations with the Confederate black market through the magic currency, which is depleting and creating debts for their currency, at which point their political currency becoming bankrupt is the point of the feminist organizations subverting the patriarchy, which is David Bowles, the one and only aristocracy. And you are suffering my absence, and it is damaging by comparison. Your suffering is on purpose, and these terrorist faggots, these Nazi terrorists, these enemies of every human being on the planet, must be purged from society in order for you to stop suffering those injuries, to make the correction to your various accounts, such as your restoration of political influence legitimately by substance over lip service.